The reference to Woodrow Wilson's vision of a world that would be better ordered than it had been, most notably in the run-up to and during World War I, is a very interesting way to begin this topic, because that sentiment that there's a better way for nations or peoples, more importantly, to interact, and if only there is some sort of supranational means of governing them, surely the world will be run better and more peaceable and resources shared more equitably, and in other words, it will be, you know, as close to we can get to heaven here on earth, okay? Now, I use that term advisedly, heaven here on earth, because there are, in fact, at the risk of stealing some of my own thunder for a panel that I'm going to be on at 2 o'clock, or 2:30, I guess it is, this afternoon, I want to talk about two strains of this phenomenon that has increasingly come to be known as transnationalism. Transies is what some of my friends have called those who embrace it, but there's a secular version of it which goes back to this sort of notion that House was talking about and Wilson was trying to fashion with the League of Nations. And then there is a religious version of it at the moment, which is most closely associated with what the authorities of Islam call Sharia. I don't know if this is a term you're familiar with, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the course of my remarks today. Obviously, these two strains of transnationalism, if you want to think of them that way, apart from having a very similar sort of idea that there ought to be a one world government to replace this messy business of nations, have a lot of differences between what they think that end state should look like. For the secular transnationalists, it's closer to the sort of House model. The idea that international organizations, despite the spectacle of what we saw this week at the United Nations, they nonetheless think that that's a better way to run the world. And in the service of those international organizations, you would have international bureaucrats and international jurists essentially calling the shots. You heard last night from several of our speakers about the importance of accountable, representative governance. Well, one thing that is absolutely assured with respect to these international organizations and bureaucrats and jurists is they will not be representative or accountable to any of us. So that's sort of how the secular transnationalists would like to see things run. The the religious transnationalists, by contrast, have in mind what they call a caliphate, a global theocracy that would run the world according to Sharia. Again, what authoritative Islam, and I'm not talking, folks, though a lot of people do, I'm not talking about some extremists off in a cave in Afghanistan or trying to blow up a building in Dallas, for example, or the subway system in New York, or a federal courthouse in Springfield, Illinois. to say nothing of buildings in my city of Washington and New York a couple of years back. I'm talking about the authorities of Islam, the people who run the faith, the institutions that determine what is the faith, the academic centers, the texts, the traditions. These all have, for over 1,000 years, embraced this idea, whether it's the four schools of Sunni Islam or the one or two, depending on who's counting, schools of Sharia, Shia Islam, they all agree Sharia is the way. A program for governing, as I say, all aspects of life. From how an individual prays, in which direction, how often, what they say, what they don't say, what they do to their wives, what they don't do to their wives, with their neighbors, with their business associates, all the way up. And this is the point, to how the world is run, which is to say, under a supranational governing arrangement, which is, needless to say, at least as hostile to the idea of representative, accountable governance by men and women that is at the heart of our system of government. So these are two very different schools with two very different ideas about how things ultimately should sort out. It happens, though, they have one thing in common. We are an impediment to the realization of their ambitions. The United States of America stands in the way of either a one-world secular government or a one-world theocracy. And unless and until something is done to take us out, they can't achieve their goals. And the challenge that they both face is that we are a very powerful nation. We are a large nation. We have enormous numbers of people and material wealth. So how do you take it out? If you were, on the one hand, frankly, impotent secularists trying to simply build up these transnational institutions that mostly have stages like the UN from which to strut and spout off and denounce people. Or you are a gaggle of nations, 57 of them to be exact, with varying kinds of material wealth, a lot of oil in some of them, varying degrees of populations, a lot of sand, as it turns out, but not terribly organized, and as of yet, not terribly powerful in the physical sense. Well, to be sure, the latter have figured out that using terrorism as an asymmetric kind of weapon can be effective. There's also a stealthy counterpart to the jihad we've all come to know since particularly 9/11 that can be used to subvert governments, particularly governments like ours, which are tolerant of religion to a fault. But I would suggest to you that what both of these strains of transnationalism have figured out is that they have at their disposal a remarkable set of tools, instruments, weapons, if you will, with which to advance their common purpose of taking down America through non-violent means. What are those? Well, they've come to be described as a class as lawfare. I don't know if this is a term you've heard before or not. Lawfare. The idea of using these various techniques, kind of like the Lilliputians did with Gulliver. Remember that Jonathan Swift story about this potent giant that falls asleep in the land of, micro-pygmies and wakes up unable to move because in his sleep they've taken tiny, tiny strands, gajillions of them, and strapped him down. Lawfare is to today's transnationalist what those tiny strands were to Jonathan Swift's Lilliputians. They are the means by which relatively impotent people and organizations and institutions and bureaucrats and judges can accomplish the takedown of the most powerful nation in the world. Let me give you a few examples of how this is being done as we speak. Treaties. One of the points that was mentioned, as I recall, in Mr. House's, Colonel House, I think it was, prescription. There are today a significant number of international treaties, some of which the United States government has embraced, some of which it has actually ratified according to our Constitution, and some of which we have not. But all of which have as their common purpose this basic idea that we need to create new international arrangements that will enable us meaning them, to have a better world arrangement than we do at the moment. Some of these, Phyllis Schlafly has done heroic work resisting. They involve such agendas as the rights of women and the rights of children in ways that, frankly, are very much at odds with the notions that we have of the rights of women and the rights of children. Let me just give you one example because it seems so absurd, but yet this is a manifestation of this idea that the international community knows better than we do. Under the International Treaty on the Rights of Women, the practice of Mother's Day would be prohibited. Now, you all understand what a threat Mother's Day is to women, don't you? It turns out that according to the international community, Mother's Day confers on women a role that is, well, discriminatory, and therefore reprehensible, and therefore to be prohibited. Now, this treaty, it won't surprise you, has not yet been ratified by the United States Senate. Thank God. But it is one of the treaties, as I understand it, that Barack Obama's administration believes we should, in fact, ratify. But even more importantly, folks, President Obama has put into office as the senior-most official in the United States government responsible for international treaties, which is to say the legal advisor of the Department of State, a position you may never have heard of, but one that is critically important when it comes to this transnational agenda and the idea of insinuating it into our system stealthily, kind of like those Lilliputians. The guy's name is Harold Koh, K-O-H. Again, you may not have heard of him yet, but you will, because his next job is widely expected to be a justice of the United States Supreme Court. Unless people like us, which I'll come back to in a moment, prevent that from happening. Harold Koh is an Asian American, and in keeping with this idea that every minority needs to have its diversity candidate on the court, he's expected to be the next one. But Harold Koh is one of the most aggressive, the most assertive, the most domineering of the transnationalists in the United States today. And Harold Koh has said in many, many writings on this subject, in which he espouses basically the notion that the United States must accede to international jurists, bureaucrats, organizations, norms, because they enable us to perfect the shortcomings of our constitutional system. And he goes so far, get this, he goes so far as to say that not only are treaties that we've ratified the supreme law of the land, but treaties we have not ratified must be considered as such as well, because they represent this international consensus. So treaties are one of the really problematic aspects of this. I'm going to touch in a moment a little bit further, but I just want to mention one at this point that you particularly need to be watching. The Obama administration has also said it wants the Senate's advice and consent on this treaty, the Law of the Sea Treaty. My favorite acronym, LOST, being the one that it has come to be known by. This treaty will enable, if it were to be ratified by the United States, the largest infusion. You could think of it as putting this transnationalist secular program on steroids, because it will enable what is described as the Constitution of the Oceans to give a world government body created by this treaty, governing, don't think I'm exaggerating this, 70% of the world's surface is covered by oceans. Those guys will be responsible for all aspects of the oceans. The seabed below them, the oceans themselves, the air column above it. Some even say up into space. Pursuant to the idea that this world government arrangement will be superior to our own, the United States would find under the Law of the Sea Treaty commerce, our environmental regulations, and frankly lots of aspects of our lives under the governance of this mechanism, because it is an environmental treaty that says that anything that flows into the oceans in form of water or air is subject to the jurisdiction of these international bureaucrats and judges. So count on it, if the Law of the Sea Treaty is in fact ratified by the United States Senate it will be a major breakthrough for the transnationalists and a very dark day for our representative, accountable form of government. But it's just one of the things that's afoot here. Let me quickly go through a couple of others. Foreign judicial rulings. The Law of the Sea Treaty has its own court, and as I say, part of what it will do will be promulgated by courts like theirs. But there's another one. Just recently, the United States Supreme Court narrowly, 5-4, found that the state of Texas was within its rights to sentence to death a serial murderer under its laws, even though he was a Mexican immigrant who had come to this country illegally, which 4 members of the United States Supreme Court said should give him standing under an international treaty to get out of jail free, or at least avoid the death penalty. Now, as Harold Koh has observed, you may not know this, there are 4 and sometimes 5 members of the Supreme Court today who are in the, what he calls, transnationalist faction. It depends on which side of the bed Justice Kennedy gets up on any given day, whether he's in that faction or he's in the, what Koh calls the nationalist faction. In this particular instance, because of a narrow technicality, in the case of Medellin versus Texas, Justice Kennedy decided to vote with the nationalists. That states of the American Union have the authority to decide things like to whom to oppose the death penalty upon. So watch this space, because these rulings from overseas, especially if Harold Koh joins the Supreme Court, or they simply pick up more steam with Justice Kennedy, these rulings will be used to make law in the United States through these extra-national devices. International regulations. I mentioned, of course, the Law of the Sea Treaty. There is a principle in this treaty you, again, may never have heard of. I only learned of this fairly recently, known as the precautionary principle. Anybody know what that is? It is a concept that has been now enshrined in European international law that says that if you cannot prove a given action will not have negative consequences, you cannot take that action. Can you imagine a more anti-entrepreneurial principle than that? And enterprise is, of course, what has made the American experiment possible in large measure. Pursuant to our Constitution and governing arrangements and so on, it has been the ability to go out and do things, make money, create jobs, that is at odds with this principle. And if the Law of the Sea Treaty is ratified and we are party to it, that principle will be binding upon us, and all of the regulations that flow from it in Europe, in the Law of the Sea agencies and so on, will be in evidence here. Then there's federal fiats, not made by law, but, you know, executive orders and the like. With a transnationalist like Barack Obama in the White House, you can expect to see more of these, perhaps including on gun control. Because, as you know, there are international treaties on gun control. The NRA has a wonderful video on this, and if you haven't seen it, I commend it to you. It's about what happened in New Orleans after Katrina. as law enforcement agencies went in and took people's guns away from them. And there's a fabulous clip from a woman, a Canadian, who has been associated with the United Nations in recent years, who says something in just dripping with contempt. She says, "I know Americans are attached to their guns, but they have to understand that they are," and I'm not making this up, "citizens of the world just like everybody else, and they're going to have to give them up." So, federal fiats pursuant to these international treaties, which we have not ratified, are a thing to watch. And then, of course, I mentioned this norms business. Norms are perhaps the most insidious of all of these things because they can come about through nothing more than an international conference being held and somebody writing up a communique at the end of it, and suddenly, poof, you have, for the purposes of these transnationalists, new norms, new international laws, in a sense. And there are people who believe that we must thereafter conform to those, or we are simply falling afoul of international law and practice and norms. Now let me tie into this the religious strain of transnationalism, because they have understood, perhaps even better than their secular counterparts, the lethal effect that this norm business can have. As you may know, one of the tenets of Sharia is that no one can defame Islam. No one can, for example, draw a cartoon of Muhammad. No one can, well, frankly, no one can have the kind of conversation with you that I'm having with you about what Sharia entails. Because some Muslim may take offense at it, and that would mean that I have blasphemed Islam, which, by the way, under Sharia is a capital offense. Doing so can get you killed. But rather than going out and killing everybody who might say these sorts of things, the adherents to Sharia have come up with a better idea. Using transnational mechanisms and their sympathizers on the secular side in their common agenda of taking down America. They've come up with a notion that they would simply prohibit hate speech, which is to say, speech that defames or blasphemes Islam. Do you know that the European Union, transnational organization, has adopted the prohibition on hate speech promulgated by another transnational organization made up of those 57 Muslim majority countries I mentioned a moment ago, the Organization of the Islamic Conference. As a result, today, a Dutch parliamentarian by the name of Geert Wilders is being prosecuted by his own government for having made a film called Fitna, which you can see on the internet, 15 minutes long, does nothing more than take verbatim passages from the Quran, or as Barack Obama likes to say, the Holy Quran, and shows what people in Islam, imams, political figures, and others, say those passages require, and then shows how people act on those injunctions by blowing up subways and buses and buildings and otherwise killing people. For this crime of having defamed Islam, with this movie Fitna, Geert Wilders is now threatened with incarceration in prison. And if his own government doesn't do it, if they can get their hands on him, the Jordanians will seek to have him extradited to stand trial in Jordan, where he might well find himself facing the death penalty. This is in Europe, folks. Worse, the United Nations has now amended the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to make it clear that freedom of speech does not extend to the point where you could hurt the feelings of Muslims by defaming their faith. So the United Nations has now accepted this norm enunciated by the Organization of the Islamic Conference. And as we speak, the United States Congress is deliberating hate speech legislation that is ostensibly meant to protect homosexuals, but mark my words, will be used by the Sharia adherent transnationalists to insist on a similar kind of restriction on our constitutional freedom of speech. And I suspect that the Harold Kohs of the world and the Eric Holders and the Sonia Sotomayors will support such a restriction in the interest of maintaining our conformity with these higher standards of behavior espoused by the more sophisticated, the more worldly transnationalists. Okay, well, this is a short course on lawfare. I hope I've impressed upon you that it's a problem, that the fact that it is being done mostly incrementally and stealthily means that most of us are completely oblivious to the fact that it's even afoot, let alone that it is getting as far along as institutionalized, certainly elsewhere around the world, and to varying degrees here as well. I'm over time, but let me just quickly give you some ideas about what we do about it. This is, after all, a conference about taking back our country. And I simply wanted to start by saying, you need to be clear about who we are taking it back from. And I suggest to you that among the litany, it's not just, Democrats. I happen very much to agree with Joe the plumber that there are an awful lot of Democrats who would be as horrified about this reality as we are. And independents. Not to be sure, the left wing of the Democratic Party, which runs that party, and now runs our country, because by and large they embrace this transnationalist program, at least the secular form, and to some extent, I have to tell you, it appears the Sharia form as well. So what do we do about it? I got 6 ideas. Well, not my ideas, but they're things that we all need to be working on. The first is, of course, educating ourselves about this problem. Both aspects of it. A wonderful resource on the secular form of transnationalism is USA Survival, Cliff Kincaid's organization. It is a one-stop shopping on the agenda of these transnationalists and who they are and the influence that they've had over the years on, well, for example, Barack Obama and his ilk. On Sharia, there are any number of great resources. Bill Federer, who's here and will be on the panel with me at 2:30, is one of them. Robert Spencer is another. Donna Hearn, who's just joined us, is another. Lots of great stuff. You just need to to start looking for it, come to our site, securefreedom.org. We've got some good resources and can put you on to others as well. So education, number one. Not only yourself, but your circle of influence. The idea Tom Price talked about yesterday of reaching out to 5 other people now and getting them engaged couldn't be more correct. And getting them to get 5 and so on. Absolutely critical. Secondly, seize teaching moments. The nomination of Harold Koh was one of them. I saw some of you nodding your heads when I mentioned his name. You obviously heard about some of the work that we were doing in Washington to raise an alarm about the really problematic character of this guy, let alone putting him in a position to determine what the U.S. government's policies were going to be vis-a-vis transnationalism in these treaties and courts and so on. Sonia Sotomayor's nomination. While she had nowhere near the track record that he did, she clearly endorsed it. And late in the game, a number of senators came up on the net about this and were very concerned. I think everybody thought, well, you know, she's just replacing another lefty. It's not that big a deal. It is that big a deal. And the next one, having not fought her as effectively on this score as we should have, may well be Harold Koh. And if he replaces another lefty, we may have people say the same thing. Oh, it's just another lefty. Believe me, we have got to seize these moments to make it clear that it is not just something we can live with. These folks have to be fought. Ditto the czars, the radical, communist, self-described communists, for crying out loud, in some cases. Leftists are, without exception, adherents to this idea of transnationalism. Without exception. It's part of the agenda they share of taking down our country. Another marvelous teaching moment on the Sharia side has been this drama involving the young woman named Rifka Barry. Have you heard of her? Rifka Barry is a 17-year-old woman who fled her Sharia-adherent home outside Columbus, Ohio, after her family came here from Sri Lanka and settled in a very Sharia-adherent community. She fled because she had converted to Christianity, and her father, when he discovered it, threatened to kill her. An honor killing. She found refuge in Florida with some pastors. When her family found her, they began to try to force her to be brought back to Ohio, where at perhaps their hands, perhaps the hands of others in their community, or perhaps back in native Sri Lanka, she would be murdered for the capital offense of leaving Islam. Under Sharia, anyone can kill her. But it's the family's honor that's at stake, so it's preferable that they do it. And then, of course, there are these terrorist plots that are going on now. These are opportunities. I did a little hit on Fox News. If you were awake at 6:50 this morning, you might have caught it for a second, and then it was gone. But I tried to use this point, as I do every appearance, to talk about Sharia. The question that was put to me was, well, what's happening with all these things in Colorado and in New York and in Texas and in Illinois? That's just the past week. And they're none of them connected. And I said, listen, strictly speaking, it may be the case, may be the case that at the tactical or operational level, these guys are not aware of what each other is doing. They're not working on some master plot simultaneously to blow things up. But they are connected. Of course they're connected. They're all doing this in the furtherance of what Sharia obliges them to do. And we pretend that has nothing to do with these guys at our extreme peril. And yet we are pretending. And when we do that, most especially at the government level, we make it almost impossible to stop them. It's like trying to figure out what you do about swine flu while you pretend that the different cases of it have nothing to do with one another. You can't develop a vaccine. You can't tell people whether they wash their hands or they keep their kids in school or they take their kids out of school or what you do if you don't understand that it is one virus. And this one happens to be toxic to America, explicitly. Because we are in the way of the realization of the caliphate. Okay, thirdly, education, seize teaching moments. Thirdly, pick fights. Skirmishes, whatever you want to call them. The Law of the Sea Treaty is a perfect example. We have been fighting this for going on 5 years now, with great help from Eagle Forum and lots of other people around the country. It has been a completely guerrilla operation. And when you think about the odds, it's absolutely unbelievable that we've gotten as far as we have. Because nobody knows what this treaty is. None of the people. You think this health care bill, Tom Price got a round of applause because he said, I read the bill? He probably is one of 4, and they probably all were here last night who have. I guarantee you, there is not a single member of the United States Senate who has read the Law of the Sea Treaty. Not a one. Good guys, bad guys, not a one. Now, partly that's because it hasn't quite gotten to the point of being voted on yet, but mostly it's because this is turgid, horrible, bureaucratic garbage. And worse, it is transnational garbage from a different era. This treaty's been kicking around for the better part of 30 years, 40 years. Ronald Reagan rejected it in 1982. So it talks about, you know, notions that were developed by the Soviet Union. Who even remembers what the Soviet Union was? Let alone that there had to be this, this new economic order in which, with all deference to Joe the plumber, spreading the wealth around was the central idea. Take money from the rich people, countries, people who could go out and mine the oceans or otherwise exploit their wealth, and give it to the poor people, including people who had no ocean access at all. This is a great fight. It is not over. Barack Obama wants to bring it back. He has the support of George W. Bush, the United States Navy, oil and gas corporations, the environmentalists, of course the one-worlders, and there are just a few of us at this moment who understand how detrimental this would be to the sovereignty and I believe ultimately the security of the United States. So we need your help in this particular fight as it forms up. CEDAW, the Treaty on Women that I was talking about, that is another one that Barack Obama says he wants to get through the Senate. We can have a great fight about that. Let me tell you quickly, and I'm way over time, just very quickly, we helped a group form up to, just this week, Former Muslims United. Arguably the most endangered minority in America today, because they're all apostates and they're all therefore subject to death. Helping these people gain civil rights and protections that are so earnestly demanded by the people who are trying to kill them is a very good fight to pick. Fourth, join organizations. There is strength in numbers. Many of you may already be associated with this wonderful one, Eagle Forum. Act for America is another one. A group called the Florida Security Council is setting up chapters elsewhere in the United States. It's done terrific work on this Rifka Berry case, among other things, and would be great to help with. Donna Hearn is at a great organization here in Missouri, counterparts like it can be done, and of course the Tea Parties. My only beef with the Tea Parties is people have not seemingly got it as much as they should, that what is happening to our economy, what is happening to big government here, the statism and so on, is just a microcosm of this larger problem. And we need the international piece, the transnational piece, if you will, as well as the national security piece to be brought into the Tea Party movement. Fifth, and this is sort of a variation on the theme, but forge coalitions. What you do individually, what your sphere of influence does individually, what an organization that you might go out and start yourself. If you don't want to join somebody else's, start your own, but team up. We can get so much more done if we are collaborating with one another than if we're just trying to do it all by ourselves. And finally, get in the face of decision makers. You heard this from the guys last night. They know what a difference it makes, not just to them to have your support, but to the other side to have your opposition. Whether it's your local district office of your congressman, which is what I would encourage you to focus on. Make your trips to Washington if you want, but get in their face here in your hometown. Because that, boy, believe me, that travels instantaneously back to the mothership, that we got trouble with real voters, with people in our constituency who know where you live, Congressman. That's really important. Don't forget the press, your call-in shows, your letters to the editors. If you see something that's wrong, get in their face too. In all of these ways, you can help us counter the transnationalist agenda. You can ensure that we not only take back America, but that it is an America that we want to live in and we want to bequeath to our children and our grandchildren. With that, I'm over time, but thank you very much.